T minus 50 seconds. T minus 40 seconds. T minus 30 seconds. T minus 20 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Women's Wrestling Talk, the #1 women's wrestling show on the planet.
Hey y'all, welcome. Thank you guys for watching Women's Wrestling Talk, the #1 women's wrestling show on the planet. I am your girl Stephanie Hardy, aka at Queen Steph Hardy, and I'm a co-host of Women's Wrestling Talk, but I'm also the host and creator of the Hardy Wrestling Podcast and a commentator for the Belladonna division in Gaston, Alabama. I am so happy to be here with you guys to talk about the top 5 Sensational Sherri moments. Now, a lot of people may or may not know about Sensational Sherri, depending on what part of wrestling history you were born on. I know, of course, I was born in the 90s. So when it comes to a lot of wrestling history, there's a lot that I did not experience, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and basically even before then. There was a lot that I didn't experience, but I'm grateful that I had my father to tell me what wrestling history is, and shout out to him because he was able to tell me what's going on with wrestling history and how it ties into wrestling for today. So if you may or may not know, Sensational Sherri was basically an amazing wrestling manager, and she was a women's wrestling champion for many years in WWE, and when it was WWF, of course, and in AEW, well, not AEW, I am so sorry, with WWF, WCW, AWA, and the like. But she was mainly known for being a manager for the likes of the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, Shawn Michaels, the Macho King, Randy Savage, and Harlem Heat in WCW as well. And I'm really proud to have the opportunity to talk about her, seeing as she was billed as being from New Orleans, Louisiana, but a lot of people don't know that she was actually born in Birmingham, Alabama, which is also where I was born too, and it's my hometown. So shout out to Birmingham. If you're out there watching, please let me know in the chat if you are from Birmingham, Alabama, or if you're from the South, and just shout yourself out and just say hi if you're watching. But yeah, this is definitely for us Southern people. This is definitely a good moment for us because she is one of our people, and I'm just really happy to be covering her. So without further ado, we're going to start with our top 5 Sensational Sherri moments. Now, this was based off of an article that was written by Chris Rigby, and shout out to him for being a contributor to Women's Wrestling Talk and our website. That's www.talkpod.com. So please check that out if you have a mind to. Please look at any other articles that we might have, which are top 5 countdowns, different articles, channeling everything that's going on in women's wrestling today and in the past as well. So please check that out. So we're going to start with number 5. And number 5 is a beautiful moment where Sherri Martel, before she was Sensational Sherri, she was known as Sherri Martel, and she was an accomplished women's wrestler at the time. But for this number 5 moment, we're going to talk about how she was able to win the WWF women's title from the legendary and, of course, controversial Fabulous Moolah. Now, imagine being trained by the Fabulous Moolah for a good chunk of, your wrestling career and going on to defeat her. Like, if you may or may not know, Fabulous Moolah was, of course, one of the more accomplished female wrestlers at a time in which women's wrestling was just finding its footing in the early, like a long time ago, like in like the early 50s, 60s, and 70s. And she was a part of the reason why a lot of women's wrestlers that you saw during that time were able to stand on their own 2 feet. And then she was actually responsible for training a lot of them, and she was also tied to a lot of controversy involving women's wrestling, but we won't get into that here. We're only here to talk about Sensational Sherri. So imagine making your debut as a women's wrestler in WWF at the time and wound up defeating one of the longest reigning women's champions of that era. Like, that's crazy, right? So it's just like when you have all of that going on and you're able to beat them, to beat a person like that who has such an amazing repertoire of wrestling talent and just being able to have a resume like the Fabulous Moolah, you beat her at your debut, right? Like, that's got to be the craziest thing ever. But she was able to do that, and she was able to hold on to the title for over 400 days. Like, that's a pretty long time. That's basically over a year in which you're able to hold that title. And you get to say for the rest of your life that you beat the Fabulous Moolah. Like, that's crazy, right? So after that, sadly enough, though, the women's division in the WWF at the time, this was like in the night, this was around 1987. Around this time was when the women's division in the WWF was dissolved. So there wasn't a whole lot. So there wasn't a whole lot of women's wrestling after that point. But just imagine making your debut and being able to say that you won the women's title. And I also found out through a lot of research that she was also the AWA women's champion at the time. So she was a double champion, kind of put you in the minds of in modern history, like Paige, who was a former WWE Divas champion and the NXT Women's Champion at that time. She was a double champion. She never lost the NXT Women's Championship. And when she made her debut the night after WrestleMania 30, she defeated AJ Lee for the Divas title and basically went on to have an amazing feud with AJ Lee after that point. So I guess you could say that Sensational Sherri opened the doors for women to have double titles at that time, like Becky Lynch and Becky Two Belts. She was responsible for that, but a lot of people don't necessarily know that information because it happened so long ago. So yeah, the number five Sensational Sherri moment is Sherri Martel defeating the Fabulous Moolah for the WWF Women's title. Now, of course, number four was where I was first introduced to Sensational Sherri, and that was at the 2006 WWE Hall of Fame ceremony. Now, of course, during this time, you had a star-studded class going in here. You had the likes of Eddie Guerrero. You had the likes of Bret the Hitman Hart going into the Hall of Fame in this class. And as it turns out, Sensational Sherri was only the second woman to be inducted into the Hall of Fame, of course, after the Fabulous Moolah. And she was able to make her speech and tell all kinds of stories. Of course, you know that the WWE Hall of Fame is known for all of their amazing stories that the legends, get up on the stage and tell and talk about how they were able to pave the way for the wrestlers of the present and also of the future. So when Sensational Sherri got up there, she was able to do this speech. And mind you, I'm not really a new wrestling fan, but at the same time, being introduced to Sensational Sherri for the very first time, I'm thinking, okay, well, this is cool. She's being placed in the Hall of Fame. This is great. Now, mind you, I was a kid at this time, but imagine being able to see this woman take her place in a very strong manner amongst all of these men, of course, who have paved the way for so many male wrestlers. And then you have Sensational Sherri get up there and basically tear the house down with her speech. And if she was inducted, by one of her clients, the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. And he was able to get up there and tell a story about how when she started in wrestling, she moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and she met a wrestler who was also a bar owner, and his name, I believe, was Butch Reed. um she asked him, and she saved so much money from working as a waitress that she was able to pay for wrestling lessons. But before she was able to pay him for the wrestling lessons, um he wanted to test her. So he took it upon himself to give like a weird act of violence towards her and slap her in her face to see if she had what it took. But ironically enough, she said, "Is that the best you've got?" And he decided to take her on as a wrestling student. And the rest was history after that. And I thought that was a really cool part of Sensational Sherri's speech, because she was able to get up there and tell so many stories about her toughness and her wit and how she was able to win so many women's titles, but also be, the side and basically be at the side of so many iconic wrestlers, such as Shawn Michaels and such as Ted DiBiase and such as Macho Man Randy Savage. And she told so many stories about how wild Randy Savage was as a wrestler. And she also told stories about herself. She was able to be completely honest and talk about herself in the sense, while also basically just throwing zingers at everybody who is her friends. And she was able to get up there and talk about how Pat Patterson was able to keep a partner in terms of to keep a romantic partner longer than she ever did, because she was married multiple times. And she was just making all sorts of jokes at a lot of the wrestlers' expense. And she definitely made jokes at Ric Flair's expense, but we're not gonna go into that. But it was really amazing to see her go up there and sort of take her place and just be this firecracker of a woman, get up here and take her place. And then another amazing part of her Hall of Fame speech was how she dealt with a heckler. Like, she was able to get up there in front of a heckler and basically talk about, like, there was this one heckler who kept yelling at her and kept yelling at her over and over again while she was trying to talk. And she told this man multiple times, "Look, you paid for your ticket. You paid for your ticket to listen to us talk. So you be quiet and listen." And everybody applauded her. And there were a lot of audience members who were rooting for security to throw this man out. And at that moment, I really couldn't blame her when rewatching it, because, when you're trying to, it's kind of like when you're trying to watch television and you have a person or you're trying to watch a movie at the movie theater and you see them on their phone and you see this beaming light and it's distracting you from getting into the movie. That's pretty much what was going on. And she really was not having it that day. And if it's one thing about us Southern women, when we are tired or something, we will let you know. And she let that man know, and he basically stayed quiet for the rest of her speech. And it was just really good to see this woman, like I said, take her place, amongst all of these men and women. And then to look out into the audience and see the likes of Ashley Massaro, who is sadly no longer with us, and Mickie James, who is a historic women's wrestler and manager herself. Like, to see so many of these women of the past in the 2000s, and also, and even the likes of Charmel, who, happy birthday to her, who was sitting besides Booker T, who was also managed by Sensational Sherri as well in the Harlem Heat tag team. It was just a really beautiful moment, for the women to have. And it was just a really cool moment to sort of see Sensational Sherri just be this firebrand of a woman. And it was a great introduction to me, because it's just because I didn't know who she was. So to see her, be this amazing woman in this speech, just, sort of solidified my love and respect for her, not only as a women's wrestler and not only as a manager, but just as a woman, period. Because, we have to take our place and be awesome no matter what. So that's moment number 4. That's Sensational Sherri and her Hall of Fame speech. And I do recommend that you go back and watch it, because it is amazing. Please go back on Peacock or whatever it is you watch past WWE stuff on and watch that speech. It is incredible. So number 3, we have Sensational Sherri managing Shawn Michaels in his sexy boy gimmick. Now, of course, she was fresh off of managing for Randy Savage, and I believe fresh off of managing for Ted DiBiase as well. So she went, and also Shawn Michaels was fresh off of turning heel on his partner Marty Jannetty of the Midnight Rockers. That's a little old school for you. This entire top five is old school, but so he was fresh off of turning heel for the very first time. So when these two came together, he put on his sexy boy gimmick. And something that a lot of people may or may not know is the fact that Sensational Sherri was behind Shawn Michaels' first iteration of his sexy boy theme song. You know, the song where he goes, I think I'm cute. I know I'm sexy. I got the looks that drives the girls wild. Well, it wasn't him singing it at first. It was Sensational Sherri singing that song at first. Like, it's so crazy to think about that because it's just like, and when you go back and listen to the song, she sounds like this girl who's just crazy about her man, you know, like, ooh, he thinks he's cute. I know he's sexy. Like, it's just so cute. It's so funny to listen to because it's such a contrast from the iconic Shawn Michaels version of his theme song that we know now. And it was so iconic that it just followed him throughout his career, even when he quit being the whole sexy boy heartbreak kid thing. Now, around this time, when he was a heel, he was playing off of his looks, and she was always carrying a mirror with him. When she was his manager, she was carrying a mirror to the ring so he could always look at himself, right? Like, it was just the cutest thing because he just thought he was so cute with his little mullet and stuff like that, and his sunglasses and all of his frills with all of his outfits. But she wasn't to be outdone either with all of her outfits either. Like, she would come out with her face paint on, with hearts on her cheeks and stuff, and they were just really cute together. And you could tell that she really did sort of add to that allure of him just being this heartthrob, right? And I know I have a couple of friends who feel like, you know, when a long time ago that he, you know, was really cute. And mind you, when I was introduced to Shawn Michaels, you know, he was saved. So I didn't see him, you know, until I saw older clips of him, you know, acting like that and being this whole sexy boy thing. But it was just so funny to see him acting like that in contrast to saved Shawn Michaels, is what I call him. But it was just really funny. But just to think about Sensational Sherri, you know, adding to him and this whole heel dynamic that he had going on at the time, which is absolutely, you know, hysterical, but it was also brilliant because they just fed off of each other. She just thought he was the sexiest thing walking, and he was just the arrogant heel who was just, you know, feeding off of her. And there were also some weird times where I saw a couple of pictures, they're not on here though, where she was, you know, worshiping him and feeding him grapes and all that other stuff. And it was just kind of like, you know, of course now we wouldn't, you know, take too kindly to that. But back then that was just the excess of wrestling in WWF at the time. And it worked for his gimmick. So, you know, a lot of Shawn Michaels' success at that time as a heel, he owes to Sensational Sherri. So that's our number 3 moment. That's Sensational Sherri managing Shawn Michaels. Now, number 2, we are in our top 2 territory, was a really, really crazy moment. It was a promo that she did with Macho King Randy Savage and Tiny Lister, who was known as Zeus at the time. So during like the late 80s, there was a movie that came out with Tiny Lister and Hulk Hogan called No Holds Barred. And it was really popular because, of course, this was the Hulkamania era, and Hulk Hogan was everywhere. He was all over the place. Now, mind you, he's very controversial now, but there was a point where he was the most beloved wrestling character in all of wrestling during the 80s. He ruled the 80s and the early 90s as well. So he was in this movie called No Holds Barred, and he was in it with Tiny Lister, and Tiny Lister was playing this character called Zeus. So they incorporated the Zeus character into WWF programming, and he tagged with the Macho King Randy Savage. And they were able to have this match um, that was called the No Holds Barred, the movie, the match, where they were in a cage, except this was a tag team match where Hulk Hogan was the WWF champion at the time, of course, and he was tagging with Brutus the Barber Beefcake. And Macho King Randy Savage and Zeus were tagging together, but Sensational Sherri was by their side. And the funniest part about the entire promo was just the fact that you had so much excess going on. You had Zeus, with his rah voice, like saying, Hulk Hogan, rah, I want you, Hulk Hogan, rah. And then you had the Macho King with his voice saying, ooh, yeah, I'm going to ruin you, Hulk Hogan, in this match. No holds barred, yeah. And you would think that somebody would sort of shrink in the middle. You would think that a third person would shrink in the middle of these two just being extra and talking about how they're gonna lay total destruction to Hulk Hogan and Brutus the Barber Beefcake. There's nothing you can do. You can't get out of here in a cage match. And this was an old school cage, right? So they're doing this promo in this fence where they're trying to, like, they're grabbing onto this fence, and it's an old school cage, and it's blue bars, right? It doesn't look like the silver fence cage that we know and love today. This was a blue cage, and they're holding on to it like prisoners, being and it's just being all kinds of crazy, right? But then you would think that a third person in the midst of all of this would be, like a shrinking violet. No, you saw Queen Sherri at the time, Sensational Sherri at the time, climbing, up and down the fence, saying, you won't know what to do. Hulk Hogan, you won't know. You won't know. You won't know. And it's just so crazy. And I'm just looking at them like, oh my God. It's the craziest thing on the planet. It's like you're watching all of these crazy monsters just go on and on about how they're going to lay total destruction to their opponents. And it's just 80s. It's just an 80s vibe, man. And it's just crazy. Like all of the outlandish stuff of the 80s that you would imagine, that is what was going on in this promo. And I definitely recommend that you go on YouTube and look it up, because it is absolutely wild. And then you had Sensational Sherri just climbing and climbing the fence and climbing the cage. And then she moves from behind the cage and then goes in front of the cage, and she's like, total destruction. And it is just the craziest thing. But I definitely recommend you guys go back and watch it, and also go back and watch the match if you have a mind to. So yeah, that's number 2. It was a pretty crazy number 2, but it's number 2 nonetheless. It's Sensational Sherri's promo for the No Holds Barred match between Hulk Hogan and Brutus the Barber Beefcake and the Macho King, Randy Savage, and Zeus. And of course, we have to do number 1. Number 1. Number 1. Number 1. What's number 1, you might ask? Well, number 1 is Sensational Sherri and her performance at WrestleMania 7. Now, this is really retro, of course, because this was, of course, in the 80s as well. And you had the Macho King. Well, actually, I believe this was in the 90s, but the early 90s. But you had the Macho King Randy Savage fighting in a career-threatening match against the Ultimate Warrior. And I went back and actually watched some of the lead up to this match, and it seemed like Sensational Sherri, who was Queen Sherri at the time, was messing with the Ultimate Warrior a lot in all of his matches, like a really great manager does. And she was trying to get in his head on behalf of the Macho King. And of course, WrestleMania 7, was their, career-threatening match. And this was where Macho King was doing his entrance in this picture, and you had Queen Sherri sitting on the throne right next to him, just with all the extraness. Their outfits were matching. She had on this beautiful silver one-piece suit that puts you in the mind of Tina Turner. Like, it was just really cute. And it was just all the excess, of that time. And you have, of course, the Ultimate Warrior, who changed up his whole thing, didn't run to the ring like he normally did. He walked slowly to the ring. to sort of sell the moment of them fighting, on behalf of their careers. Like if you lost this match, you had to retire. So it was a really killer match, for the time, of course. But one of the best parts of this match was Sensational Sherri's performance. She kept interfering on behalf of the Macho King so many different times that it was a couple of times where I thought Sherri was fighting in the match and not Randy. Like she was beating up on the Ultimate Warrior. She kept distracting him, on the apron, even in high heels, y'all. Like high heels. Like you cannot underestimate women in high heels. We get stuff done either way. But it was just the craziest thing. She was in high heels, distracting him on the apron. She was punching him whenever he fell outside of the ring. Like she was kicking him a couple of times. There was even a time where she even tried to jump from the top turnbuckle into a slam onto him, but then ran into the Macho King by accident. Like she was probably the most active of a manager that I had seen. And actually, no, that's not true, because she reminds me a lot of Zelina Vega and her work with Andrade, and how she would get involved in all of his matches, and how she even climbed up on a ladder one time to help him win the United States title in more recent history, of course, before he left WWE, and how she would get involved and hit hurricanranas on their opponents as well. Like she would do all kinds of crazy things. And it seems like Zelina Vega was a student of Sensational Sherri as a manager, because a lot of the things I saw Sherri do in WrestleMania 7, Zelina Vega did some of the same things, or Queen Zelina. But either way, oh, they're the queen. Hey, you can tie that together. Either way, you could put those two together. And it was just like the craziest thing. Like, I almost wanted Sherri to fight Ultimate Warrior instead. And he was pushing her, but it seemed like Sherri was just full game for all of it. But ultimately, none of those tactics would work out. And Macho King wound up losing the match to the Ultimate Warrior, which meant that he had to retire. But much to the chagrin of Queen Sherri, she was losing her meal ticket at the time, which is something that Bobby the Brain Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon kept reiterating after the match ended, on commentary, rest their souls. She was angry about losing her meal ticket, and she kept attacking the Macho King even after he lost. She was kicking him essentially while he was down. Like he was really upset about losing, but throughout the match they kept putting the camera on Miss Elizabeth, who had been a partner and had been married to Randy Savage and was actually serving as a former manager for him at the time before he became the king and the king of the ring, and then abandoned her for Sensational Sherri. So as she was in the ring watching the match and watching Sherri attack Randy while he was down, she could not take it anymore, and she finally attacked Sherri on behalf of Randy and grabbed her by her hair, as you can see, and just threw her out of the ring. And she just couldn't take it anymore. She was absolutely upset, and she just grabbed her and just drug her out of the ring, and she was just in shock the entire time. And it was just a really funny moment. And of course, after this point, you have Randy just getting up looking all discombobulated, because he just knows that somebody was beating up on him but wasn't sure which woman it was. And he comes to finally and realizes that Elizabeth was fighting on his behalf, while Sensational Sherri was outside the ring fussing with the referee, Earl Hebner. And finally, once Randy comes to and realizes what was going on, and Miss Elizabeth, mouthed the words, "I love you, Randy," they get back together. They get back together and they have this beautiful moment where he lifts her on his shoulder and they reunite, and he realizes that Miss Elizabeth was his one true love and was the only woman to truly stand by him, even when he wasn't the king and wasn't all this other stuff. Like, they loved each other. And if it wasn't for Sensational Sherri and the performance that she put on throughout the whole match, being by his side and then ultimately turning on him in the end, then we wouldn't have got that touching moment where Elizabeth, just thrusted Sherri off of him and they finally reunited. So I know when I was rewatching it myself, I got a little bit emotional. Now, mind you, this was years ago. This was years ago, and before I even knew what wrestling was. And sadly, a lot of these people, who participated in this program are sadly no longer with us. But the power of WWF and WWE sometimes is just the fact that when the emotion is real and when the performers are fully dedicated to whatever it is that they're doing, they are able to give a performance that just resonates emotionally with its audience. And even when Randy and Miss Elizabeth got back together, you saw so many people in the audience shedding tears because they were invested in them as a couple. And I was invested for the few minutes I was watching it because I was just like, this is so amazing. And it's just so, when a performance is good, a performance is good. And I feel like WWF/WWE deserves more credit for a lot of their acting choices that they put on in terms of that. Like, seriously, they should be nominated for awards like Primetime Emmys and stuff like that. Like, get on that, Television Academy. But that's the number one moment is Sensational Sherri's performance at WrestleMania 7. So I definitely recommend that you go back and watch some of these moments because they are absolutely amazing. And Sensational Sherri is a woman in women's wrestling history who I believe deserves more credit than she is given. I feel like, of course, since she passed away in the early 2000s, a lot of people really don't give her a lot of credit, and a lot of people don't talk about her as much anymore because, of course, as life, and as wrestling progresses, there's so much history and so many timelines we've seen that it's easy to forget some of these people. But we shouldn't forget Sensational Sherri at all because she's definitely worth remembering. She was a women's champion. She was a heck of a valet, a heck of a manager, and just a heck of a woman, period. She followed her dreams and she was very persistent in following her dreams. And she didn't let any men or any, preconceived notions about women's wrestling stand in her way at all. And she followed her dreams and she became a pillar of wrestling history that we should always remember and go back and also cherish, whenever we can and just give her flowers. And I'm really proud to have this moment and this platform to give her flowers as a sensational woman from Birmingham, Alabama, just like her. So, Sensational Sherri, we love and we miss you, and we will always give you your flowers here. So, thank you guys for watching this top 5 edition of Women's Wrestling Talk. As usual, know that you can find me, Stephanie Hardy, on Instagram and Twitter at Queen Steph Hardy, like it says on the screen. You can also follow my podcast, The Hardy Wrestling Podcast, on Instagram at Hardy Wrestling Podcast and on Twitter at Hardy Wrestle Pod. That's Hardy like the Hardy Boys. And you can listen to my show everywhere you get your podcasts as well. And continue to support Women's Wrestling Talk. We're a growing channel and we are very passionate about women's wrestling and it growing and it just continuing to be the awesomeness that it is. So with that in mind, thank you so much for watching Women's Wrestling Talk, the number one women's wrestling show on the planet. And thank you for watching this top 5. And until next time, bye y'all.
Women's Wrestling Talk, the number one women's wrestling show on the planet.